Hope you guys had a good weekend. Our unit, this unit, is going to be on agriculture, and so we've been referencing this a lot. This idea of subsistence agriculture, which means you're growing crops to consume it for your survival, and then commercial, which is more indicative of developed countries and growing things for profit. So let's go ahead and cut into it. Before we look at specifically those, we have to understand, excuse me, how agriculture came about and kind of what it actually does and what it means. The first thing in this slide, we see the invention of agriculture, which isn't something we typically think about, that agriculture had to be invented. It was kind of laid at our feet, if we're being honest. But prior to there being any true agriculture, where people were truly growing plants, because the definition here, if you look at the bottom, is that agriculture is the deliberate modification. In other words, you mean to do it. It doesn't happen by accident. Like people have to understand what they're doing when they put seeds in the soil and how to nurture that and how to grow it. Prior to this, people basically just hunted and gathered. That they were wandering aimlessly, trying to find food every day. You can think about kind of like the shows Naked and Afraid or Ultimate Survival and stuff like that in relation to this. And there are still groups of people that live this way. It's very gender oriented. Men do the hunting, women typically do the gathering of nuts and berries and things like that. And typically, and I'm going to go into the slide here, typically we see this done in groups of very small tribal groups of 50 people or even less because it's tough to feed anybody, tough to feed more people than that. You need people to help you hunt, yet if you get too many of them, you can't feed everybody. So in traditional settings, especially, 10,000 years ago, your tribal groups were 50 people or less. And like we said, it was very gender oriented. And so people typically traveled following the animals that they hunted. This has been going on and still is going on in very isolated areas of the world. But for some reason, my mind always goes back to, especially even in the 1800s, with the Plains Indians and the Lakota tribes and the Sioux and the Crow and all these groups. They followed the buffalo. That was their main source of survival. So I don't want you to get the misconception that there are no hunters and gatherers anymore. There are. There's just very few of them, and they live in very isolated and rural areas. And we see that here. This would be modern day hunters and gatherers in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at these dots, these are the dots where you'll find modern hunter-gatherer groups. And what you notice about each of these areas is they're extremely isolated, they're extremely rural, and most of the time they're not conducive to agriculture. These are maybe your plains tribes that have reservations who just do this as a form of carrying on their lifestyle. They don't necessarily have to. But these areas in northern Canada are the Inuit populations. You may have heard them called the Eskimos. The Amazon rainforest, the indigenous groups that live there. It's very tough to grow crops there, but these are groups that aren't involved in modern day society. Same thing in the Congo or the Aborigines in the outback and some of these other very isolated tribes in Southeast Asia. So it is practice, but if you look at this, like we're talking about 5/1000ths of the world's population that actually take part in this. Um, and so you'll occasionally see it, like we said, Arctic, you can't farm in the Arctic. The interior of Africa and the rainforest, the Congo, or even in portions of the Sahara Desert, which that isn't reflected here, but it is practiced there as well. Australia with the Aborigines, and then South America with some of your native tribes here in the Amazon rainforest. One of the things to keep in mind here is that this idea of hunting and gathering was the main way that people grew their food for about 80 to 90% of our human existence. Now, we've never grown up like this. Everything we've known has been a very modern technological world. But if we say that, human beings first domesticated plants in 10,000 BC, well, what that means is that prior to that, from the inception of man, that they'd been doing this for whoever knows how many years. And so this is farming, especially the way we farm now, is an extremely new way that we get our food. The other thing that you take into account here is what stage of demographic transition would these groups of people who are hunting and gathering be in? And the answer is stage one. They have very little technology. Now, we've said there are no stage one countries in the world any longer, but there are groups of people who still live in stage one. High birth rates, high death rates, as a result of limited technology, and that would be these groups of people. Again, they are still there, but very, very, very few of them. And so then we hit something that we're going to key in on here for a second. There are actually three different agricultural revolutions that the world has seen: the first, second, and third, but we'll see them called three different things, and y'all need to make sure you write this down. They will be referenced as being the Neolithic, which is the first agricultural revolution, the agricultural revolution, which is called the second agricultural revolution, and then the third one is known as the Green Revolution. But we're going to focus on the Neolithic first. The Neolithic Revolution is the first agricultural revolution. People think it took place between 10 and 8000 BC. And what it was is when man stopped hunting and gathering and basically was able to start farming. What we see as a result of that is that the population tended to grow, not as rapidly as it did with the Industrial Revolution, but obviously, if they had the ability to start growing crops, they had more food, which means they could sustain more people. The other thing, and if you look at this chart, prior to this, everybody hunting and gathered. They were nomadic, meaning they constantly moved from one area to another. And it says they waited for migrating animals to return each year. Well, this turned life upside down for the better, because what it meant was people learned how to actually farm. They knew how to put seeds in the ground. They knew how to grow crops. And so they didn't have to travel any longer. They could actually settle in a village, create, these very rudimentary cities. And when it says they learned to domesticate or tame animals, it means that as a result of that, now you could tame ox or horses or anything else to help you with the farming. And so the Neolithic Revolution didn't mean they were automatically developed, but what it did mean is that they could create food for themselves. And what's important to understand is that our world didn't change very much from 8000 BC until we hit the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s AD. And so you're talking about, if you do some simple math, 10,000 years of human existence where we lived in this capacity right here. You farmed, you had food, but you still didn't have any medical technology. And we know that based on previous units, life didn't change dramatically until the Industrial Revolution hit. So here we go. We just talked about this, the Neolithic Revolution. Well, for 10,000 years, people lived in this capacity until they got to the Industrial Revolution, and there was another agricultural revolution called the Second Agricultural Revolution. And what we see is that they coincide. The Industrial Revolution created machinery. This machinery could be used to help grow food. And so you had more food, you had people growing, they could feed more people, and this is when we see stage 2 of demographic transition hit and the population explodes. So as a result of having more machinery, as a result of people moving to cities, this was the second agricultural revolution that coincides with the Industrial Revolution. The third agricultural revolution is known as the Green Revolution. And all I want y'all to remember here that makes it more simple is this is science in food. Started in the 1950s, and this is a big key. It was meant to stop third world hunger. A guy named Norm Borlaug is the one who started it. And what they started doing is creating what's known as biotechnology. Some of you may have heard of GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And that's what they started making. They made seeds that could grow in dry conditions. They started making, crossbreeding plants that were more drought resistant or could grow in cold climates. And what it did was it increased the amount of food that could be grown. The negative of that, though, and I want you all to watch Food Inc. later in the week, is that typically people don't just give their products away. You make something, you expect people to pay for it. And so as good as it's been, a lot of these LDCs that they was meant to help, they haven't had access to that food because they can't afford the seeds. But essentially, the Green Revolution is science and food. It started in the 50s, and it's still going on today. We also see, and I don't care if y'all remember Carl Sauer necessarily, but there's two different types of planting. Y'all are good with seeds. You take seeds, you put them in some dirt and some soil, you put some fertilizer in there, give them some water, and you wait for them to grow. Most everybody's done this. We actually did this with our daughters the other day. It was some type of little plant that they're trying to grow in the backyard. These are things that we have been very familiar with. But vegetative planting When it says direct cloning of plants, y'all are like, what the heck are you talking about? So rice is a good example of this. Most of the time when rice is planted and cultivated, they don't necessarily plant a seed. They can take the rice out of the ground, they can split it into two, and they can take those two and then replant it again. Potatoes can be done the same way. If you ever saw the movie The Martian, again, who is it? Matt Damon? I think that's right. Matt Damon is trapped on Mars. All he has left is like, I don't know, 30 potatoes, and he knows that he's going to starve. And so what he ends up doing is chopping up these potatoes and replanting them, and new potatoes grow. That's vegetative planting. So when it says that you're cloning plants, you're cutting stems, you're dividing roots, it's just a very simple way of doing it, where you can take a potato, cut it into small pieces, and replant it, and then you'll have more potatoes grow. Okay. And this is what we're going to end with today. Probably the biggest thing that you need to know the entire unit. Fill these charts out on your review guides. You can come back and look at this later. Is that there are 5 differences between subsistence and commercial agriculture. The first one is called the purpose of the farming. Who are you doing it for? We're going to go down subsistence first, then we'll hit commercial. Subsistence agriculture is done to survive. You're growing crops for yourself. As a result of this, and we've talked about this already, the primary sector is huge, because if you're growing crops for you, you're not feeding anyone else, which means they have to feed themselves. So everybody farms. So you have a large population involved in agriculture. As a result of not making any money, you cannot afford any machinery, which means that you can't have a big farm, because if you're using hand tools, you just need a small plot of land. What also goes on here, though, is that if everybody is farming, you're going to have lots of different small farms, because you can't have a big farm. And then lastly, there is no relationship to the business, because if you grow it, you eat it, and that's it. On the other end, though, commercial agriculture is done for profit. This is what we see in the US and other developed countries. You grow crops for the purpose of selling them to other people so that you're making money. Because of this, there's only a few farmers, because everybody else is doing something. You're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're a teacher, you're a mailman, whatever it may be, and you're dependent on these farmers to provide that food for you, and you pay them in return for it. As a result of that, and they're making money, they can afford this huge machinery, tractors, combines, reapers, all these types of stuff, which means you can afford and have a huge tract of land to farm on. And so as a result of that, we see something that is called agribusiness. Agribusiness is the process of a crop going from the primary to the secondary to the tertiary sector. And if you remember from 2 units ago, we talked about those 3. So the farmer takes it out of the ground, he sells it to a place that is going to turn it in to a true product, and they give it to Kroger or Publix, or sell it to Kroger or Publix or somebody else who sells it to you. So farmer grows corn, they sell that corn to Green Giant, who cans the corn. Green Giant sends it to Publix, who sells it to you. Agribusiness. Agribusiness is all throughout our entire society, whether it's fast food chains, restaurants. It could be, the double-decker oatmeal cream pies at the racetrack that I like to buy, like we'll say once a month. Those things are really good. Either way, it's anything and everything that we're involved in. Whereas subsistence is you grow it and then you consume it. Okay, and so those are the differences between subsistence and commercial agriculture. To show you a couple of maps before we end today, you can see this as far as development. Look at the percentage of farmers in the labor force in your peripheral countries. Highly undeveloped areas. Even China still has a labor force that has almost 50% of its population involved in agriculture. But then you see farmland per tractor, huge farms in these areas, because everybody else is doing something, and so they don't need large tracts of land. So the farmers in these areas have huge tracts of land. Okay. Subsistence, hand tools versus commercial. Okay, which has machinery. And we'll stop there for today. So look at these. We'll come out with another one tomorrow, just to start looking at the different types of agriculture and LDCs. Y'all stay on top of your stuff. We'll be releasing more information as the week goes on.